Happy Sunday. It's good to see everyone again. So, last week we talked about living for eternity, where we discussed the existence of the spirit world and how important it is to continually strengthen our spiritual health. Today, I wanted to talk about a rather serious topic. It's on the root of sin. Now, what is sin and where did it come from? How this original sin is actually impacting us even today. So let's start with looking at some definitions. The sin, according to the dictionary, is an immoral act considered to be a transgression against divine law. And if we go into original, means present or existing from the beginning, first or earliest. So if you combine original and sin, you can kind of deduce that it basically means the first transgression against divine law. Now, when I looked up original sin, it elaborated a little bit more. Original sin was defined as the tendency to sin, which is innate in all human beings, held to be inherited from Adam in consequence of the fall. So this concept of original sin is not new. It was actually developed in the writings of St. Augustine. And it's an important doctrine of the Catholic Church and most of Western Christianity, basically stating that everyone is born sinful. In the divine principle, it acknowledges the gravity of this original sin and the importance of discovering the root cause. So let's read. No one has known the root of sin, which lies deep within and ceaselessly drives people toward the way of evil. So there's a few challenges with this original sin. The first, according to the principle, is that no one really knows the source or the root cause. And this reminds me of a quote from a movie called The Usual Suspects. There is a main character, Kaiser Soze, who at the end of the movie says that the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world that he didn't exist. So it's a real challenge. If you don't know the source of the problem, there's actually no way to find a solution. In fact, if we're ignorant that the problem even exists, then there's no even intention to address or fix the problem. So that's definitely one major challenge with original sin. The other is that it ceaselessly drives people towards the way of evil or to transgress against divine law. So that's a problem, right? If original sin really kind of pushes or kind of guides or makes people do evil acts, then that is a real problem. There's a quote from the Bible where Paul laments in Romans chapter 7, verse 23 and 24, but I see another law in my members, warring against the law of my mind and bringing me into captivity to the law of sin, which is in my members. O wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from this body of death? So even St. Paul, who was really a righteous Christian, he suffered from this battle within himself, where he wants to do God's will, but he knows that he has these tendencies towards sin. So without addressing these two challenges, we will never be able to be free from this original sin. And all the conflict and suffering that comes from it. So in order to find a solution, we must first go deeper into the root cause. How did this original sin come about? So let's take a look. So there's a story. Many of you know the story. It's the Garden of Eden. And this is the story of Adam, Eve, and the serpent. But we're going to retell the story in a way with deeper understanding. The traditional understanding of this story is that there was this beautiful garden. that God created for Adam and Eve. And he basically said to Adam and Eve, you can have everything you see in this garden. It's all yours. But of one fruit of one tree in the center of the garden, you shall not eat. If you do so, you will surely die. So basically, God said, you can have everything except for one thing. So Adam and Eve, they get it. They're like, okay, that's fine. But then there's a serpent. And this serpent is able to converse with Eve and basically tempts her to go against God's warning not to eat of the fruit, and basically tempts her to eat of the fruit. She does so, and she ends up also tempting Adam. And so they both eat of this fruit. They suddenly feel ashamed, and they are basically kicked out of the Garden of Eden. So this is the story of our first ancestors, and it's not a happy one. And there's always meaning in stories. So it's really important to understand the meaning behind this first story. Now, there's some fundamental questions that the divine principle raises around this traditional understanding of the story of the garden. Let's read. Adam and Eve fell when they ate the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Many Christians to this day have thought that this was the fruit of an actual tree. So one question that arises, was the fall or eating of this fruit that of an actual literal fruit or an apple? That's one question that comes up. There's another challenge. But would God, the loving parent of humanity, make a fruit which could cause the fall to look so attractive? Would he place it where his children could reach it so easily? So another question that arises with the traditional understanding of the story is, why would a loving God put something so tempting and deadly in a place that is easily accessible to his children? Now, some may argue that it was a test of obedience, that God wanted to know that when God said, do this, that Adam and Eve would follow. No questions asked. But would a loving parent put a poisonous cookie on the kitchen table to test their children's obedience not to eat it? I understand, I'm a parent myself. We want to make sure our kids follow what we say, but I know that I wouldn't risk the lives of my kids just to test their obedience. So that's a question. Let's take there's several other questions. Let's read. Humankind is beset by the original sin, which has been inherited from our first ancestors. Yet how can something one eats cause a sin which can be transmitted to one's descendants? The only way something can be inherited is by being passed down through the lineage. So this third question is, how does eating a physical fruit have such grave consequences and even affect your descendants, your children, your children's children? You know, according to the Bible, it says that we've all inherited this original sin since the time of Adam and Eve. So would the eating of a literal fruit have that kind of lasting impact on humanity? Another point, in the world before the human fall, what act would one be willing to carry out even at the clear risk of one's life? You know, God says clearly in Genesis chapter 2:17, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, thou shalt not eat of it. For in the day that thou eatest thereof, thou shalt surely die. And Eve even repeats this commandment to the serpent in Genesis 3:3, saying that basically God said not to eat or else we're going to die. So Eve knew that clearly that was God's commandment. So the question is, why would Adam and Eve risk their lives over a fruit? One thought comes to mind. There's a delicacy in Japan called the fugu, which is a fish that has a poisonous sac inside. And only the most highly trained chefs have the ability to prepare that fish well. Because if one mistake, and you can actually die from eating that fish. So question is, would you be willing to risk your life to taste a fugu fish? Actually, some of you might say yes to that, but if you really think about it, even if there was a 1% probability of death, would you do it? Because this was something that God made very clear to Adam and Eve, and they understood it, that if they were to eat this, they would surely die. Why would Adam and Eve risk their lives over a piece of fruit? Another point, we read that before they fell, Adam and Eve were both naked and were not ashamed. After the fall, however, they felt ashamed of their nakedness and sewed fig leaves together into aprons to cover their lower parts. This is also a very interesting side effect of eating of the fruit, this feeling of shame and the need to cover their lower parts. If they had committed a crime by eating some actual fruit from a tree called the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, then they certainly would have covered their hands or mouths instead. It is human nature to conceal one's faults. So why did they cover their nakedness or lower parts after eating the fruit? One final question that comes to mind in the traditional story is that, does the punishment fit the crime? So yes, God did say, if you eat, you shall die. And also, they were kicked out of the Garden of Eden. So again, as a parent, of course, I want my kids to listen to what I say, but if they don't, would I kick them out of the house? Especially if it's something like, oh, you ate that cookie when I told you not to. Get out of my house. That's a question. Does the crime fit the punishment, or does the punishment fit the crime? As you can see, there are numerous questions that arise with the traditional understanding of what happened at the Garden of Eden. But fortunately, the divine principle uncovers a deeper understanding of this garden story that addresses all of these questions. Let's take a look. So there's a few key elements in the story. So let's cover the first one. The serpent described in the Bible was able to converse with people. It caused the fall of humans who are spiritual beings. Furthermore, the serpent knew the will of God. This is compelling evidence that the being which the serpent symbolizes was a spiritual being. There are no beings endowed with such characteristics other than angels. So the serpent, according to the divine principle, is not a literal snake, but it's a symbol. Just like in many stories, there are symbols. And even in the Bible, there are many symbols and metaphors that even Jesus himself makes to help the audience understand deeper truths. So the serpent was not just a physical snake, but it symbolized the archangel Lucifer, who could converse with Adam and Eve, who was trusted by God, who knew a lot of things about God's will. And anyway, we'll go into the stories later in a future sermon, but it makes a lot more sense that it wasn't a physical snake, but rather the archangel Lucifer. Another key point, Eve was created in an immature state. She was to reach full maturity only after going through a period of growth. Thus, it was possible for her to bear either good fruit or evil fruit through her love. This is why Eve's love is symbolized by the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and why Eve is symbolized by the tree. So basically, the story of the garden, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, actually represents matured Eve, a mature woman, right? Could either bear good fruit or evil fruit. It all depends on how the love is aligned, or how the love is whether it's true love or false love. And the fruit is not a physical apple, but it represents Eve's love. Okay, so that's what the fruit is. It represents Eve's love. And finally, we have learned from the above elucidation of the Bible that the root of sin was not that the first human ancestors ate a fruit, but rather that they had an illicit sexual relationship with an angel, symbolized by a serpent. Consequently, they could not multiply God's good lineage, but instead multiplied Satan's evil lineage. So this is the big one. Eating the fruit is not about consuming a physical apple, but it symbolized engaging in a sexual act. So the main point here is when Eve partook of the fruit, it meant that Eve had an illicit relationship, sexual relationship with the archangel. And then when Eve tempted Adam with the fruit and Adam ate of the fruit, it means that it was a symbol of Eve having a sexual illicit relationship with Adam. Okay, so trying to spell it out as clearly as possible. That this is what the divine principle discloses. Now, looking at this understanding, let's review the questions that were mentioned before and how the principle understanding can address each. The first question that I mentioned was, why would a loving God put something so tempting and deadly in a place that is easily accessible to his children? With this new understanding, we can see that it wasn't a physical poisonous fruit in a garden, but it was a symbol of Eve's love, or rather the sexual organs, which are in a central location of your body. So the tree and fruits were symbols of the center of the garden, right? So the tree was in the center of the garden. Your sexual organs are at the center of your body. So it was symbolic of really the sexual love. How does eating a fruit have such great consequences and even affect your descendants? Well, we know that sexual relations do affect your lineage. In fact, it determines your DNA of your descendants. So more than eating a physical fruit, a sexual relationship can have impact on your lineage and your descendants. Next question was, why would Adam and Eve risk their lives for a fruit? Well, I don't know if some people would do that, but if it was love, and particularly sexual love, we know that people do crazy things for love. And we also know that the power of love is stronger than the power of principle. So it makes sense. If it was sexual love, then it makes sense that Adam and Eve would risk their life, be willing to risk their life and be tempted by that, even though they were told that they would surely die. Next question was, why did they cover their nakedness after eating the fruit? Well, it makes sense. If it was sexual love, then it makes sense why they covered their lower parts, right? Because that's where they incurred the original sinful act. And finally, does the punishment fit the crime? Now, eating a fruit out of disobedience may not fit the punishment of death and being kicked out, but introducing false self-centered love, that makes sense. That could be something that would completely disconnect you from God and his original love, and that you would be outside of his realm of original love based on that kind of sexual illicit love. Now, there's a lot more detail to this, but because of time, I'm just going to the straight conclusion of the key points that the divine principle discloses in this section of the root of sin. We will be taking a few more weeks to uncover different aspects of this in future sermons. But I encourage you to study more on this topic, especially if you have questions. Also, I want to make a note here that this understanding came as a revelatory truth to Father Moon, and it's not just a theory based on study. Also, I know that Father Moon has stated that this was the most difficult truth to uncover, that he had to go through tremendous trials for this particular truth to be revealed. Okay, so now that we discussed the root of sin, the question is, so what? How does this story that happened millennia ago impact my life? Why does it matter anyway? So let's take a look. Sexual promiscuity is a principal cause of the downfall of numerous heroes, patriots, and nations. Even in the most outstanding people, the root of sin, illicit sexual desire, is constantly active in their souls, sometimes without their conscious awareness. There are so many examples of leadership succumbing to this particular temptation. You know, I've heard scandals in the Catholic Church, Boy Scouts, presidents of different countries, or presidents of companies, including the US, and even leadership within our own community. No one is immune from this temptation. And sexual promiscuity, it completely destroys trust. It also destroys faith, right? Trust between husband and wife, trust between leadership and membership, trust between yourself and God, right? When you know that you committed something that was against God's will, against the original principle, then your relationship of trust with God can also be severely damaged. Let's continue to read. No one can prevent the plague of sexual promiscuity, which has become increasingly prevalent as the progress of civilization makes lifestyles more comfortable and indolent. Therefore, the hope of an ideal world is an empty dream as long as this root of all evils has not been eradicated at its source. Again, no one is exempt from this original sin and the tendencies that come with it. The effect of this original sin can be seen all around us. You know, you hear stories of envy, of lust, adultery, even sex trafficking, all that. Where does that come from? It comes from this strong desire for sexual promiscuity, right? Even wrath, right? Anger, violence, all that comes usually by related to love, spurned love, right? Also greed. People want to accumulate more wealth, more power, so that they can attract, you know, a lover or something like that. And finally, sloth, right? I know that, you know, even getting addicted to pornography and things like that, it actually debilitates you to do much else. You become almost a slave to that. So this original sin is no light deal. It has impact in all of our lives, in all of the world. So without addressing sexual promiscuity, there is no hope for an ideal world. But I don't want you guys to be depressed. I mean, this is a Sunday sermon. We're supposed to be inspired. So there is hope. And I want to state that knowing is half the battle. I don't know if you guys remember G.I. Joe, anyone? I think that was one of the slogans, knowing is half the battle. By identifying the root cause, we can start to gain dominion over this problem. Until now, we could only address the symptoms. But if we understand that the root of sexual promiscuity is immature, self-centered, physically driven love, also known as godless love, then we can actually start to address the problem. Okay? But again, without knowing the root of the problem, there's no way of finding a solution. Actually, Father and Mother Moon, they really understood this point, and that's part of the reason why they introduced the marriage blessing. The marriage blessing is designed to reverse the curse of false love. It's really designed to, instead of centering your love on your needs or your attraction to each other or your desire for a partner, the blessing of marriage is designed to help you center your marriage on a higher purpose, on God or on God's ideal. It also encourages and educates us to really think about your partner first, not just my own desires and needs, but how can I love my partner from God's viewpoint? So it's not just a physical attraction, but really encouraging the spiritual love to be at the center. And I want everyone to know that even if you may have made mistakes in the past, there is always a way, a pathway to restore original love. I want to end with just a few tips on how to manage this original sin tendencies. First point I'd like to make is hold tightly onto God's word. You know, Adam and Eve should have connected with God daily. If they had been conversing with God, if they had communicated on a regular basis, then they wouldn't have gone that way. Similarly, the more we engage with God's word on a regular basis, it's going to actually protect us. Another quick tip, don't do things alone. Like be in a room with a man and woman by yourselves, unless you're married, then you're okay. But if you're single or even if you're married, don't be in another room, in a room by yourself with another person of the opposite sex, because the power of give and take is real, right? So know that the temptations are automatic, they exist. So don't put yourself in compromising situations. Another point I'd like to make is that by communicating your challenges and temptations with the mentor you trust, then you can actually address the problem. The problem is that we keep our issues to ourselves in secrecy, and then it kind of continues to fester and grow. But if there's someone you can trust that you can communicate with and report to, this will take out a lot of the ongoing temptation that comes with sexual sin. Just a couple more points. Make sure you don't judge those who are struggling with this, because it is a real issue. And know that more than a physical desire is actually connected to an emotional need, a need for love. And that's what everyone is looking for. Yeah, I guess I'd like to just kind of wrap it up with, you know, God really wants each of us to experience true love. You know, imagine you're a parent, you have children that are grown. You want your children to experience true love. You don't want them to go off and experience the heartache and being torn apart by false love. You want your children to experience true love. The same thing for God. God wants each of us to experience that true love, but he knows that he can't force it upon us. It's not automatic. He gave us a portion of responsibility, which he cannot even interfere with. But know for surety that God maintains the hope that each of us will choose a path towards lasting love. In summary, sin is a transgression against heavenly law, and the original sin was not simply an act of disobedience by Adam and Eve of eating a literal fruit, but was an illicit sexual relationship between the archangel Lucifer and our first human ancestors, which introduced false, immature love into this world. No one is exempt from these tendencies, but we can restore original love by intentionally connecting with God's word and committing to the marriage blessing introduced by Father and Mother Moon. So the root of sin, it started with this immature, self-centered love. And that's why it's so difficult to feel God's love in our lives. We need to acknowledge these false love tendencies within ourselves and consciously work to strengthen the original love that exists within by connecting to the source of true love, which is God, our Heavenly Parent. So through this devotion to God, through practicing loving others, and ultimately committing to the marriage blessing, whether you're currently single or married 20 years, that commitment and that ongoing commitment, we can actually work towards restoring original love. And this is what will substantially build the kingdom of heaven here on earth as God intended. So with that, I just want to thank you. I know it was a lot to cover today, but this is a very important topic, and I hope you're able to gain something from this. So have a great week, and God bless you.